We're nearly 2 weeks into the commemorative year of 2016 and the first public row has already happened. The Save Moore Street group consists of campaigners wanting full restoration of the last buildings used by the 1916 rising leaders on Moore Street in central Dublin. The government is planning to turn some of the houses in the terrace into a national monument, but not all of them. Last Thursday, protesters, including some of the descendants of the Easter rebel leaders, occupied parts of the terrace and several hundred others protested outside on the street, calling the government plans a demolition of history. Primetime's Barry Cummins has this report on what exactly is going on.
It's the end of April 1916 and amid chaotic scenes, the volunteers who have held this building for 5 days are forced to flee the GPO. The building is in flames. They make their way up towards the nearby small laneway of Henry Place. Among the contingent, Pádraig Pearse, William Pearse, Thomas MacDonagh, James Plunkett, a badly injured James Connolly and a young Michael Collins. They go up that laneway which eventually snakes around towards Moore Street. At this corner along Moore Street, and with British soldiers now surrounding the area, the volunteers entered the buildings here. When they would eventually leave this street, it was to surrender. That message of surrender was brought from 15 Moore Street by nurse Elizabeth O'Farrell. Her great-grandniece, Donna Cooney, says she strongly supports the protests here, saying the whole street should be preserved.
Elizabeth O'Farrell, better known as Nurse Elizabeth O'Farrell, was one of the 3 women that remained in the GPO at the end when they evacuated the GPO. Herself, Winifred Carney, and her Julia Grennan. And she came out in the last. They left in 3 dispatches, came out at the very last. They had a council of war in number 16, and Elizabeth O'Farrell was asked if she would carry the notification of surrender to the British forces. She looked behind her, she knew it was a historic time, and she took, first of all, a verbal surrender, came back, said they wanted an unconditional surrender, and then travelled back with Pearse to make the actual surrender. And that iconic photograph then was taken across the road there on Parnell Street.
Over a number of recent days, protesters occupied these buildings on Moore Street. Numbers 14 to 17 are designated as a national monument. This video shows the museum that is planned here. In these buildings, very significant things happened in 1916. The last council of war involving Pádraig Pearse and James Connolly and others was held in number 16, for example. But while there is broad agreement, numbers 14 to 17 Moore Street must be preserved, the differences emerge in relation to other buildings on the street, including those either side of the national monument.
My understanding is that number 18 and 19 were actually rebuilt in the 1920s, and number 13 was rebuilt in the 1940s. So it's not the same, and anybody that goes into either of the buildings will see that they don't have the original fabric.
Most people know Moore Street, and it's the street traders, and the whole thing should be a historic quarter. Things happened in certain buildings. You have the O'Reilly dying there, what is now O'Reilly Pig. You had people dying on these streets and on the lanes, and the evacuation. You had other people that evacuated with the wounded to Jervis Street Hospital. So all these streets are significant historically.
Protesters say they object to the current plan for numbers 14 to 17, which would see major alterations to buildings either side, including demolition work to put in place support structures for the proposed museum. Talk of demolition is what's exercising the minds of these protesters.
Save Moore Street! Save Moore Street! Save Moore Street! Save Moore Street!
One man who believes the development of 14 to 17 Moore Street should go ahead is John Connolly. He has very significant links to 1916. His father, Roddy, was just 15 when he was with the volunteers in the GPO, and John's grandfather was also in the GPO, one of the signatories of the proclamation, leader of the Irish Citizen Army, James Connolly.
Which is more significantly interesting? Number 10, where they had the first meeting, first Council of War, or number 16, where they had the final one when they decided to save umpteen hundreds of lives by surrendering, which in itself was a very brave thing to do because they knew they were going to be executed.
It was back in 2007 that the then government designated these 4 buildings a national monument, but it was only last November that work finally began on a project to ultimately design a museum on the site.
It's a very, very significant building, and when you go into it, you take a step back in time, and I want to see it restored back to what it was like in 1916. But what you will notice particularly, you see that the holes that are broken down between the houses, where the rebels came from one house into the other, and it's all back. It's there the way it was in 1916. We can see that. So we want to restore it back to what it was, and it'll be a permanent reminder and a legacy to the leaders of 1916.
The smallest butcher shop in Ireland, but we give you honest to God value now.
You don't get more Dublin than Moore Street. The original street traders have now been joined by a number of ethnic shops, a reflection of the new Dublin. If you care to look, you'll find references to 1916 throughout Dublin. This plaque at the junction of Moore Street and Henry Street marks the room on the first floor where the signatories to the 1916 proclamation signed the document. Just a few hundred feet away, behind this hoarding, the location where the leaders of those who had left the GPO took the ultimate decision to surrender.
She was just carrying a little white flag. She had her nurse's insignia on her, and she really took her life. But after that, she took all the surrender letters to the garrisons, because she was asked at that point, would she do that? And it wasn't even safe for the British forces to go down. Captain Wheeler left her in a car and left her make her own way through gunfire, you know.
At midday today, the protesters who had occupied these buildings for a number of days came out onto Moore Street saying this phase of their protest is over. The group says it reserves the right to again use non-violent direct action in the future. At the High Court, a case taken against the Department of Arts, Heritage and the Gaeltacht, seeking to stop the development in its current form, will resume in court early next month. In the meantime, there will be no demolition work undertaken at the site, but other work will resume.
At this stage, the builders will return tomorrow. Of course, they have lost almost a week now, and a week is it's a considerable amount of work could have been done in that week. But nevertheless, I would have to review the situation, and I really, really would like to see that people could get access, limited access, in Easter of this year, for the centenary of the 1916 Rising. But my plan is that the building works will be completed by the end of this year, and the building will be restored back to what it was.